So good morning to everyone again. I see we have about 90 people in the room right now. Thank you all so much for joining us on your Saturday morning. My name is Alex and I will be your MC for today. Today's session is part of Reading in the Age of Distraction, a series of conversations with acclaimed local and international thinkers on the science of reading and reading well in the digital age. Over the next few Saturdays, you'll hear from experts as they discuss the art of focused reading and learn how to become readers of words and the world around you. Now, before we start the session, I'd like to go over some quick house rules. As this is a webinar, all participants are automatically muted, but you're welcome to interact with other participants and panelists in the chat box, which I think is now open, and you guys should be able to send a message and your thoughts in there. Wonderful, good to see. If you have a question, please feel free to type them into the Q&A panel. We'll try our best to answer all of the questions, but do note we may not be able to answer every single one of them due to time constraints. And please also note that the session will be recorded. Great. Now, today in Read to Connect, you will hear about the invigorating value of reading aloud to one another, even as adults, and how this practice can counter fractured attention spans in the age of distraction. Now, let me introduce our wonderful speaker and moderator for today's session. Our speaker today is Dr. Cyndi Giorgis, who is Professor of Literacy Education at Arizona State University. She has been recognized for numerous teaching awards and distinctions at the local, university, and national levels. She is currently serving on the 2023 Newbery Medal Committee. Cyndi is the co-author of Jim Trelease's Read-Aloud Handbook and other books and professional publications. Welcome, Cyndi.
Thank you.
Moderating the session today is Dr. Jo Ann Netto-Shek, who is an educator and works in the area of language learning and literacy education in school context. She is part of the English Language and Literature Academic Group at the National Institute of Education, Singapore. Welcome, Dr. Jo Ann.
Morning, everybody.
And now I will hand the session over to Jo Ann.
Okay, so let's begin our little chat, Cyndi. So thanks so much, actually, for agreeing to this. Let's begin with reading aloud. Any from your experience, what might be the benefits for reading aloud?
Oh, goodness, where do we begin? Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about my very favorite topic ever is reading aloud. And I just think reading aloud is such an amazing gift that we give to children of all ages. And we want to include kind of in utero to elderly. I think the benefits just are so extensive and so numerous, both social, emotional, and cognitive. And I just think that there's no greater gift than reading aloud, but also there's also so many advantages and benefits and what we share with students from the vocabulary development to background knowledge, comprehension, fluency, everything you can imagine. So Jo Ann, I think maybe if we narrow that down a little bit, maybe that will be a little bit easier to answer because it's just that's such a broad question, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I thought we'd better get started, right? So much is, we know so much about reading aloud and its benefits, right, to children as they listen to stories being read to them by people they love and people who care for them, right? So let's bring it down to just to kids, right, to young children. What do you think are some of the key things children get, right, from having stories read to them, and really, I guess, what are some of the socio-emotional benefits, right, to for children listening to stories being read to them?
Well, I think, first of all, that just bonding experience that as a parent reads to a child, that comforting feeling, that bonding experience, and that bonding experience actually works across all grade levels. because there's that shared experience, that shared literary experience that we have, that we, I think if we think back of a story that our parent might have read, or a story that a teacher read, it brings up all these really great memories, right? For the most part, I hope they do.
Yes.
And so it's, first of all, I think that bonding experience. I think another one is just that pleasure of reading and realizing that there's something magical between the covers of those books. There's stories, and those stories are about people and places and things and experiences. But yeah, I think that we also get this sense of enjoyment, along with the pleasure, but there's something there, but also we enjoy it, and we derive a great deal of pleasure from hearing a story read aloud. And I think that with reading aloud, there's always that really kind of, we feel safe, we feel secure, we feel that we've entered into that nice, quiet, calming space for that period of time, in which we can just maybe alleviate stress. Even young children have stress in their lives, don't they?
Yes,
and we can just kind of step back and take a deep breath. Jo Ann, what do you think about the social emotional benefits of reading aloud?
Some of my best memories, you're absolutely right? Some of my best memories, and just seeing my parents sort of relax, right, with me, would be playtime or in reading time, right? So they would choose books that they felt I would enjoy. That's true, but also books that they enjoyed, and so there's a space, where we're enjoying this story world, right? And they're sort of navigating the story with me, right? So I don't get to see them so much as disciplinarians, because I grew up during the time where parents were very much disciplinarians, but also, just the use of the language, and just how characters, right, start to come alive in their identities, right? So that sort of ignited my imagination, right? That,
Right.
yeah, well, he's funny. Oh, I see. It's because, and then I started to see how characters sort of evolve and express their identities, right, through language. So yeah, very special, magical times. I agree with you. Very, very much so. Special, safe spaces, as you say, and interesting things for me to think about, right? Because I came from a small family, about others,
Yes.
right? How others might be, right?
Well,
Yeah. So
and I agree with you. I don't mean to interrupt. I'm just thinking about, not only do we see how others, but we also find that personal connection, right? We see characters like who we are, and we think, oh, we're not alone. And we're not alone out there. What are emotions, what are feelings, what are our experiences a character in a book has had, and also how did they solve that problem, that dilemma? And so I think that we see ourselves, but we also see characters unlike ourselves, but those problem-solving abilities too. So I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. So listening to them, just listening to stories and how characters solve problems. Absolutely. Do you think that children also, besides being affirmed, right? Do you think there are other things that they learn about life and themselves, I think, from reading aloud?
I do. I think that they learn about like themselves, but I think part of reading aloud, and I don't want to not mention this, is also the interaction that we have, whether it's between parent and child, teacher and students, is that we have that opportunity to talk about, well, what are we thinking? What do we feel? Or what are you wondering? And so we begin to think about the human condition, human nature, interactions. We begin to discuss books and express opinions, and we listen to others' opinions, and we learn how to agree or disagree, but in a way that's respectful. But we also realize that not everybody responds in the same way. And so it's important, I think, that aspect. I don't want to ever not talk about that part of the read aloud experience. It's not just you read a story and were done, like my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Guyman, who read after lunch, every day. And that was wonderful that the 5th grade teacher was reading aloud to us, right? But, he would come in after recess, and we'd settle down, sit on our desk, and he'd read the next chapter of where the red fern grows. And then he'd, after that, he'd close the book and say, okay, it's time for math. And I just so wanted to talk about the book. And I think that's something that I don't want for us to forget, that the interaction, when we talk about the bonding, part of it is that interaction that we have with the book and with each other.
And the kind of information you get, right, as a teacher, as a parent, about the child you're reading to, right? The kinds of questions they ask, right? The interjections they make, what they notice, right? Things that they find interesting, right? Also, talking and making connections to their day, right? Like, it was a really hard day, and I know how this character feels, right? So it opens up also this opportunity, right, for them to talk about their day and what's really disturbing them, and they're confused about, and they're trying to navigate, right? So the bonding, I think, is a different kind of bonding, though, right? During read aloud time, and that kind of bonding, I think I absolutely agree. It comes through the interaction, right? That many forget, right? It's not just about reading aloud, but that reading aloud opens up the interaction, right? That's happening. Do you find that to be more important, do you think, than the reading aloud bit?
The interaction, I don't know that I can separate the two, because I think when I select a book to read aloud, whether it's to, a baby, whether it's to, preschooler, elementary, high school, college student, I always select a book with intention. And the intention isn't to teach a skill or a lesson. The intention is to bring a story that might make us laugh, or what might touch us in some way, or might address something that's currently happening in society. Or, a lot of times teachers or parents will, a child is being bullied, and so they find a book about, a child being bullied, so they can talk through the experiences, which is sometimes easier to talk about a character's issues and dilemmas and how they solve this problem than it is sometimes for children to talk about themselves. And so I just think that's, I don't know that I can separate the two, that we just sit and listen, because that's very passive. And I view reading aloud as very interactive and a very active process.
Absolutely. I just want to pick up that point about reading aloud just can occur anytime, right? It can be during the day, just before you go to sleep, right?
Yes.
And that proportion, right, of listening to the story and then talking about it, right? It might depend, right, on when it's happening, right? So if it's downtime and you're trying to get them to sleep, right, then having a whole lot of interaction may not be necessary, even, it's ready, the children are ready for bed, right? Well, we've got a little poll here that we'd like to find out, right, from our participants, right? And I'm just going to leave, I'm leaving it to the host to put up the poll, right? So let's just see what the poll results tell us. The poll really is about what they're interested in, right, in terms of reading aloud. So let's just take a look at this.
Okay.
Okay, so we've
Yes.
got our poll results in, and it looks like people are kind of interested in Read-Aloud. They do a lot of it too, and they're kind of looking into how they'd like to incorporate it into their lives, I guess, right, into their routines. And of course, they're educators, right, who are thinking about how they could do this more so, I guess, with their students. So let's talk a little bit about reading aloud and perhaps the times when they could read aloud. Any suggestions, Cyndi?
Oh, definitely. As I mentioned, Mr. Guyman used Reading Aloud as kind of a classroom management tool where we'd come in and we'd sit down and he'd quiet us down, and then we moved on. Of course, that's a great time. So after children come back in from lunch or coming from a different activity or something, that's fine. But again, we don't want to forget the interaction piece, and it doesn't have to take that long. Sometimes it's like, I know I've worked with children, and it's like, you can have a 20-minute discussion, or you can try to do a 5-minute discussion, but just something there where you can have, okay, let's do 5 fingers. Let's have 5 people share their reaction to this book. What do you think? Or we can have, so tell me 3 people that said, what do you think? What are you feeling? What are you wondering? So we can kind of structure that response to kind of meet our time frame. So it doesn't have to be a lengthy response, because I know in teaching first grade, they could go on forever, especially if you read a story about a dog or a cat, right? They can go on forever. So you can kind of limit that. But incorporating reading aloud should be in all areas of the curriculum, all disciplines, all content areas. We don't need to just relegate it during language arts. We can start the day with a read aloud. We can end the day with a read aloud. We can incorporate read aloud throughout the day. That's why I love picture books for all ages, because they're short stories. They're brief, but they're the perfect package of reading aloud in a short period of time that we can discuss that. So it can be a chapter or 2 of a book, but for any age, especially for adolescents, for intermediate grade students, don't dismiss the picture book, because there's so many picture books that are so much more appropriate for an older audience than for a younger audience. So, and you mentioned at home where often it's reading aloud at the end of the day, and that's wonderful. That wonderful experience, and maybe the child falls asleep and we don't have the interaction. But you know what? They may be talking about the next day or the next evening before we read aloud again. We talk about, remember what happened last night? What remember the story? But we always talk about having book baskets everywhere. Have them in the kitchen, have them in the car, have them everywhere throughout your house, so that I don't know how many times you've had. I went out to lunch with a friend and her 2 young children, and I brought a book as a gift for them. And after we ordered at the restaurant and we were waiting for the food to arrive, these are, very young children, a 5 and a 3-year-old. So what did we do? We read aloud a story while they were waiting. There's so many opportunities to incorporate reading aloud and to build off of those reading alouds throughout the day. So there's no one time or one way to read aloud. It's all day, as much as you possibly can.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jo Ann? What are your experiences
absolutely.
with that?
I found actually that when you let children decide when they want to be read aloud to, I think is also a good, right? It's also a good indicator, right? Because they'll come and tell you, can we read this book? Right. And actually what it means is I'd like to spend some time with you, and I want to spend some time with you over this book. Right. And then also you have kids also that are quite ready to take some parts of the reading aloud, reading aloud of the book, right? So you read some parts and they're quite ready to jump in and start reading with you, right? So it moves quite naturally into a shared experience of reading aloud rather than them just hearing. But sometimes, they just want to hear you read, right? The story. They just think you do a fabulous job of it, and they just want to hear you, right? Read the story. it's really great, you know, what you say about how it's just for every age. Because I remember we were working on a project, right? And we were going into classrooms for 15-year-olds, and their own understanding, right, was that they weren't readers, and literature was just over, right, the top for them. They didn't feel, right, that they were readers. This is not important. And I just picked up Andrew Clement's book, right? And I said, okay, I'm going to read this first chapter to you guys, okay? And I think it was Frindle that I did it. And I would only read this one chapter, and then the next time I see you guys, I'll read the second chapter. But they were completely hooked because they suddenly realized that there were other people like them, right? And Andrew Clements was writing about this class of kids, right, who were just like them, right? And so it sort of opened up their whole, right, minds, right, that I can do this too. This is worth going into. This is worth reading, you know? Yeah, so it does something, I think, right, to children who feel, right, or they've not had very good experiences, reading experiences, right? It does something. It sort of tells them that it's not an academic thing. It's kind of a whole person thing, right?
And it's interesting because as we look at the research of when we start to lose children as readers, and it's around age 10, 11. And if you also look at, I don't know if there's a direct correlation here, but we also kind of stop reading aloud to children around that age because we think that they're reading independently now, so I don't need to read aloud to them. But that's so far from the truth. And as you mentioned, adolescents, they pretty much stop reading altogether. And part of it is because they're reading so much maybe for school, but they're not really reading much for pleasure. So when we begin to read aloud, we can definitely incorporate into the curriculum, but also at home, we can bring back that gift of reading and again, discover that pleasure of reading. We never stop learning comprehension. We never stop learning vocabulary, right? Some of the most wonderful, rare and unique words are found in novels and picture books. So we never stop learning vocabulary. We never stop learning background knowledge, whether it's about a time in history or it's something about an individual. And so when we read aloud about those individuals, and again, we are creating that community or that bonding. Again, that never stops, especially with adolescents. Don't you want to kind of hold on to that because sometimes they start to move away from us? And you mentioned too that sometimes children who are maybe challenged by books, by text, and this allows them and offers them an opportunity to read stories and maybe helps kind of motivates them maybe a little bit more about, I don't know, maybe I'll give this book a try. And when we also share books in various formats, because I believe picture book is a format, it also then provides permission to say, you can read this picture book, you can read this Frindle, you can read, something that's maybe a little bit more in depth. But one more thing too, I think with especially with adolescents, the stress that they're under. And when they can come in and just kind of take a deep breath. And I'm reading to my undergraduates, and they're so a little crazy in college and so much. Right. And so we come in and we start with the read aloud and just give them an opportunity to kind of breathe, but then discuss, and we create that community right there. And we kind of like, it kind of creates that mood, that tone, that vibe for our day, that positive experience and feeling. And so I just think, again, it's just the best thing, the best gift that we can offer to our students, to anyone. And I think somebody in the chat said also, reading aloud to elderly. It doesn't stop. It never stops. We should always keep reading aloud. I mean, how often do you, I read aloud, items in the newspaper to my husband. Reading aloud is, somebody acting in a movie is a way of reading aloud too. And oftentimes it's taken from a book or something like that. So, but I just think sharing a piece of literature through reading aloud should never, ever stop.
It just causes me to think, that so much of it is, picking up from someone who's raised the question here too, that very much of reading aloud is about therapy, right? Yeah, it's about, the healing, the healing aspects of it, is just it either affirms your identity or sometimes a decision you've made and you're not quite sure about it. And and just finding that space, right, to process what's going on, in your day, or it's just an important decision that you have to make, etc. Right? Is it important, you think, that we realize as adults that we need to be read to too?
Yeah, we really do, and I think, again, I don't know what happened, that there's like almost a stigma around that, like, oh, well, can't you read it yourself?
Yeah.
And I think we all enjoy a good story, and we all enjoy a good story read aloud well. And that's where, we really do need to read aloud a book before we share it with others. But, or even if you're reading, like I'll be reading a novel, an adult novel, and then I'll even if there's a passage or there's a part of it, I'll say, oh, I'll tell my husband, oh, you have to listen to this because the words are so beautiful and wonderful. So I think we all just love hearing those stories.
Yeah, I can remember a very, very close relationship I had, and we decided that just before we go to bed that we'd be reading parts of the book. The book was on Nelson Mandela. And he's got such a great way of explaining, right, how he made sense of all that happened to him. And so we did that. We just used to read aloud, and sometimes it was just these long pauses of thinking about the kinds of experiences that he went through, and what were the internal resources he had, right, to decide that he wasn't going to behave in a certain way, right? So very much, right, in terms of helping us deal with some of the things that we take for granted, right, for ourselves, isn't it, right? So that brings to mind, right, that experience that we finished the entire book doing that. Right, we were reading bits of it, right, and it was really over a digital platform that we were doing it, but it was a time to connect, and we never went beyond that, right? We just connected, and then we closed for the day, right? So yeah, the therapeutic side of it, right, and the expression, right, sometimes of a thought that you may have, and someone has articulated that expression. And you think, that's right, that's exactly how I'm feeling, right? They get to express it. So the vocabulary that kids pick up, right, from this helps them, right, to make sense and self-soothe and cope, right, with all the internal things that they may not even be completely aware they're going through. Kids in transition, I think you're absolutely right? At 10, right? That's when they're moving into tweens and into adolescence, right? They may not be completely aware, right? Do you think they choose the books? The kids choose the books, or do you think we should choose the books?
I think it's both. I think both. I mean, if they want to hear, sometimes I will book for a little bit older kids, I'll book talk a few books and say, so which one kind of piques your interest right now? And I like both. Sometimes I say, I just read this really fabulous book. Is it okay if I want to start reading aloud to you and see if you make any of the connections to it? And I also want to say too, sometimes we start reading aloud a book to kids and it just, like, we love it. And they like, oh, this is not, I'm not making connections. And it's okay. I mean, yes, it might break our heart, but it's okay to say, maybe this just isn't the right book at the right time. Or maybe it's, and sometimes kids will even go back later and maybe even a year later and say, what was that book you were reading aloud to me? Could we try that book again? And I've had that happen with kids where they go, they just weren't maybe ready for it. So I think we do want to find a book that we enjoy, but I think we really have to give children voice and choice in the books that we read aloud. And even if it's a book, especially for young children, they've heard over and over and over again, and we're like, oh, not
right?
again. But that's okay, because there's something comforting in that book. There's something that they may equate that to this wonderful shared bonding experience. It might be that they're starting to really develop their pre-reading and their reading skills. So that's okay too. If there's a book that, okay,
I can remember
again, but maybe there's one other. But yes, I think definitely children should have a voice in that.
Yeah, I can remember them saying, just pick up any book, just read, right? Anything that they're interested in, just let them read. And listen to and talk about, and just let them connect, right? And I remember also a lot of the research saying that just make every reading experience a positive experience, right? Yeah. So I think Trelease has something to say. You and Trelease has something to say. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you said that very well. I think it, and I think there's different ways that we can when we make it a positive experience, we don't make it like it's a test. I think Catherine Patterson and read it to me as a test. Let me read it to you as a gift. And if every time we read something aloud, we stop and we teach a lesson from it, or let's point out this word or that word, or when we do that, often we slow it down to the point where the comprehension is gone, the enjoyment is gone. And so if we ever want to have a book that maybe we want to teach, maybe it's great similes in that book. Well, read aloud the book first, particularly if it's a picture book. Read aloud the book first for enjoyment, talk about it, and then go back and revisit it and say, oh, I noticed some things in this book. Let's go back and look at this again. Let me read some of these passages to you. So we don't ever want to turn a book into a textbook where we are just taking away the enjoyment and we're only focused on the teaching of the book.
I know,
that's not
right?
Really what reading aloud is about.
Yeah, I think there's nothing that gets a child to roll their eyes more than when you do that.
Yes.
When you start asking them to decode, and you're asking them, so what's the meaning of this word? And and the child is like, oh man, right? And they actually want to. So it actually becomes kind of a negative experience, right? Yeah. There's a question here about reading aloud to yourself, Cyndi. Do you have any views about that?
I read aloud to myself quite a bit, actually. I'll read something that just sounds so amazing that I just want to hear what it sounds like. I want to hear what my ear picks up. I want to feel the words. My students, I have a class this summer, a graduate class, and it's a writing course, and they have a writer's notebook. And this week we've done the power of words. And so like when the students had a rapscallion or capricious, and I just love how those words sound. But sometimes I want to hear how those words sound on a page. Of course, in my work professionally, when I with books or articles, I always read it aloud before I send it off, because my ear will pick up something that my eye doesn't.
Yeah, the oral rehearsal, right?
Yep.
The oral rehearsal.
Yep. So
yeah,
I think, why not give the gift to yourself of reading aloud? I think that's a great gift to yourself.
Yeah, because writing, we put it down in writing, and then you think when you read it aloud, you start to question the immediacy, and you start to think about questions that of impact, right? Is that what you're trying to say? And why have you taken this long route to saying it? Absolutely, right? Yeah. But therapy also in terms, I guess, through audiobooks, right?
Yes.
Right? audiobooks also, you're listening to someone reading aloud a story, right? And that allows, I think, that experience, right? I don't know, is it solitary for you, audiobooks, or is it community?
It's both. It's you know, on a car trip, a road trip or something, you know, we'll take an audio book and we'll listen to it. I have a friend who they always take audiobooks when they find a book that might connect to an area where they're going, and they listen to that on the way. I think it's both.
Just a great idea.
I think it's just like when you go to a movie, right? You want, or when you read a book, you want somebody else to read it right away because you want to talk about it. So I think audiobooks can be both. They can obviously be, you know, a solitary experience, or they can be something that you enjoy with someone else that gives you the opportunity then to discuss that.
Yeah, I learned something that from you, because usually my audiobooks is just for me individually. So I've never actually done a community audiobook, but that's a great idea, actually. I don't know. I think when I'm talking to my student teachers, right, I would tell them, use your voice when you're reading out a story to the kids, and not an audio version, right? You could use an audio version. I'm really in two minds about it. I usually encourage them to read because I think it encourages the kids to talk to them. But I'm not sure. What do you think? What do you think that audiobooks also in a classroom situation would be okay as read alouds?
Definitely. I think somebody just put in the chat about listening to the audiobook and then having the book in front of you. And so again, it opens up this whole world of possibilities for children who might be challenged by text, or maybe who just love a story. But when you can hear it and you can see the print on the page, I think audiobooks definitely belong in a classroom. You know, we've always had, you know, we've progressed from some people in the audience won't know, but you know, with records, and then, you know, cassette tapes, and, you know, so now we have audiobooks. But I think they definitely belong in the classroom. And I also think for maybe like, you know, literature discussions too, if you want a child really wants to read a book, they want to engage in a discussion, but the text might be a little challenging for them, but they could listen to the audiobook and follow along in the book itself, and then have the opportunity to discuss that book. So I think audiobooks definitely belong in all children's lives.
We've had this discussion also with the student teachers, you know, about how children get to listen to different accents, and you know, and how in that way also they become, you know, a little bit more linguistically sensitive, right, to and versatile, right, to different accents and different ways of thinking, etc. So yeah, the audiobook thing, but generally, I think I have encouraged them to read aloud, right, so that the kids have this sort of a bonding experience, right, with it. So I actually haven't used very much audiobooks in terms of for read aloud sessions in the classroom, but you're giving me ideas. This is great. You know, how we could to use the audiobooks, right, for various reasons.
Joanne, I just want to jump in really quickly. And you mentioned something about hearing the voice of the reader. One of the things about audio, if there's a really great book that I feel like has a lot of dialect to it, that I may not be successful in reading, but I really want to share that book, I think audiobooks are a really great way to do that, because most audiobooks are so well done and either read by the author or read by, you know, maybe a celebrity or something. And so they're done well. And so that maybe sometimes will allow a book, you know, me to bring in a read aloud of that book, but I'm not actually doing the reading because I don't feel like I would do that book justice in maybe because it has a dialect. So, or is from a country that maybe has a lot of words from that culture, that country, from that language interspersed in it. And again, I may not be the person who would do well at reading that aloud. So I think it's a good way to bring other books that you might not,
Good point.
you might be hesitant to bring in because of that reason.
Yeah, good point. And also the diversity, right,
Yes.
is what you're talking. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our classrooms shouldn't have these walls, right? They should really open up, right, for them to experience these things. We have some questions here, whether reading aloud is the same as storytelling. So you go first, Cyndi. You can talk about whether it's storytelling.
Yes and no. I guess because I do storytelling, but I think I approach it very differently, where if I'm reading out loud a book that, I have characters, I might use different characters' voices and things like that, but I have the text to kind of rely on, to depend on, to help me. Storytelling, I usually, I think about oral storytelling, and I pretty much I'm telling the story without maybe and it's certainly not the text or illustration. So I think about it a little bit differently. Obviously, reading aloud is a form of storytelling, but it is definitely dependent upon the book.
Yeah,
what do you think, Jo Ann?
I think so. Yeah, I would agree with that. That it is a form of storytelling, but you're kind of orating somebody else's story. Right. So storytelling for me might be personal. So I might say, this is what happened to me today. And so I'm just going to tell you all the story about what happened. And I usually say, right, something like, okay, pause for a minute. This is what happened to me today. And I just want to make this point now. Right. So I see the distinction, right, between reading aloud and storytelling. So we've kind of reach this point, right, where there's just so many benefits for kids, right, but also for teenagers, for adults, right, and for seniors, right? Do you have are there different ways of reading aloud, let's say, for different groups, or is it just the same sort of patterns of reading aloud for different groups?
That's a great question. Is it different? I don't think it's a different way to read aloud. I think it's we choose different books to read aloud. We certainly read poetry differently than we read a picture book or we read a novel. And so I think it's more about the book or what we are reading aloud. I think the difference maybe in the sense that very young children have a shorter attention span, right?
Exactly,
yes.
Right?
Yeah, so they're not going to sit sometimes for, especially maybe, young children first of the year grade, they're not going to want to sit for too many chapters, so we have to select those books, but then one of the things that listening aloud does, it helps improve their listening comprehension. And so they're able to begin to listen a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. And so that's why, as we maybe go through very young children, what do we often select? Our board books, where we just have, pictures and words and not a lot of story. And then we start kind of just progressing to get a little bit longer story, and chapters. So I don't know so much we read differently as we might just select different books to read.
Absolutely.
So I think that's probably would be my response.
It's also directed by genre, would you, right?
Yeah.
It's also directed by genre. So some read alouds, the text is shared, right, between the persons and they're looking at the text, but they're listening to the read aloud. And then some genres, right, they don't actually have to look at the text, right? They're just listening, right? But in terms of the different groups also, it might be, I don't know, that I think length is a great consideration. I think that you hit it right in the head, right? Kids are just not going to tolerate you reading and reading and reading, and they're just going to be like, come on, right? This is just, so they've got a shorter attention span, but also the type of content, right? Could also dictate just how long you're doing the read aloud, right? You know, for example, if you're reading aloud Ernest Hemingway to somebody who's ailing, right? You might not want to go on and on and on about it, but if that person, right, who's ailing, wants to continue hearing, then, you know, I guess it's directed, right, by the listener, right?
I think so. I mean, have you ever read aloud a book and it's like, oh, don't stop now? And sometimes you have the time to go on, or maybe it's in the school where you go, oh, you want to like stop and go have a little suspense. You know, good writers, they stop where your page turns. We talk a lot about page turns that make you want to keep, you know, propels you through the story. And so sometimes you want to build that suspense and say, oh, gosh, I really wish we could, but we're going to have to, you know, wait till tomorrow. And Joanna, I want to respond very quickly to something I just saw in the chat. I don't want to give the impression that every time we read aloud a book that we have to do an activity. I don't want to give that impression. There's because it's just like with anything, a good thing just gets really bad very quickly. You know, it's very like journaling. Quickly. When we started having kids journal, then they had to journal every day and for every subject. And it's like, no, but what I'm talking about is just giving the time and the space. It can be a few minutes, it can be longer, to just get kids to respond. Like I said, you can just even ask those 3 simple questions. Well, what do you think? You know, what do you feel? What are you wondering? And you can do that just very quickly. Other times you might want to do something that's more of a reader response type of activity. But please don't leave this webinar thinking that, oh, every time I read aloud, I got to have an activity, because you will burn out and the kids will burn out, and it will become, as you said, one of those negative experiences. Yeah, so I appreciate that question, and I want to clarify. So thank you.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you as well, because you really don't want it to be instruction, right? You just want it to be directed by the child or the person, right? And what they want to do, right? And sometimes you just want to be left alone to think, right? About the read aloud, you know, what they've heard, right? Teenagers, I notice, like to do that. They just want to think, they want to stop, and they want to process on their own, right? Especially if they find that it has spoken to them in some way, they just want to be left alone, actually, to sort them out, right? Because they're this tailspin of experience they're going through, right? And then of course, right, seniors, etc., right? You certainly don't want to ask them to do anything after the read aloud, but they might share, I guess, some experiences that they have had in their lifetime, or, you know, if they're ailing, or, you know, like, you know, this reminds me of a time when I found a blue egg, right? Have you seen a blue egg, right? So that kind of thing, right? So yeah, it's not instruction, and it's very much directed, right, by the person who's being read to, or, you know, or the person that you're reading with, right? It's very much that directed by them, right? What they'd like to do.
And I think so too. I mean, I think for the most part, you know, if kids are, you know, like you said, they're starting to just fall asleep, or somebody's falling, you know, it's like, okay, maybe let's just end here. And you said something about it, you know, it's not always instruction, but yet just from reading aloud, kids are learning, like we said, vocabulary, they're learning background knowledge about different things. And you mentioned nonfiction. Oh my goodness, nonfiction is so important to share. A lot of times we don't read aloud nonfiction, but there's we don't always have to read nonfiction cover to cover, but there's also some amazing narrative nonfiction books for all ages to read. And so, and we're talking, you know, we're really almost talking about writing, I mean, we look at, like we said, we pause, oh, let me read this passage again. Oh my
I know,
goodness,
right?
isn't that just so powerful, right? So we were teaching all these things about reading and writing and all these different areas and subject areas and social emotional learning, all these things through the read aloud. So even if we think, oh, we have to do some lesson, no, we don't. We've already done all of these things through reading aloud that story.
Yeah, and just this thing about nonfiction, right? I mean, I've always felt that the reading aloud experience gives the adults and even children, right? If they're buddy reading, or if they're reading with their buddies, right? Or it sort of gives you insight, right, into what potentially the child might like, right? If you're the adult, right? And if you're doing it with a friend or something, right, it sort of gives you the opportunity to kind of plug in apart from yourself, right? What's going on with this person, right? I mean, it's such a good friend, right? What's going on, and with this book, kind of open up, right? Some discussions between us, and etc. So it develops that part, also the interpersonal part, right? Of the adult, the child, right? Anybody who's participating in this read aloud, right? So that bonding is also opens up this capacity in us, right? And I've always felt that we should have this capacity developed, right? That we should kind of know what's happening with people who are around us, and these are important people in our lives, right, for us. So sometimes reading aloud just helps us to plug in, right? I can remember the anecdote of this very good friend of mine who was talking about his son, and he said, I couldn't connect with him after a while, right? But I just noticed that he might be interested in this book, and he picked up the book, right, at MPH, and then he said, I'm just going to read this little bit to you, right? I don't know. And then, the son sort of said, you're doing it so badly. Let me do it, right? So he took over the reading aloud, right? And then they started talking about something that the son was so interested in, right? So that interpersonal development, you know what I mean, for him was such a big deal, right? And he said, you wouldn't believe it, but it was through the read aloud that happened, right? So I just think, right, as you participate in the read aloud, right, that sort of happens. There's a question here. Would you like to add anything to that, Cyndi, before I move to the question?
I just want to share one quick story. It's in the Read Aloud Handbook, but I have a friend, Marie, who they read aloud every day. And one time, we just didn't get to it. Well, so what she walked by one of the kids' bedrooms, and one of the older children is reading now to the younger children. So now there became this sibling read aloud, which began to, again, think about the power of that. Your older sibling reading aloud to you, and that amazing experience. So yeah, there's just all these different ways that this can occur.
Yeah. So the benefits for reading, right? If we were to, the benefits for developing positive attitudes towards reading, right, is to just keep the read aloud sessions extremely light and positive all the time, right? And to be directed by the child, etc., right? And or the person that you're reading aloud to or with, right? So it's a time of connection, right? So that's that's what this is about. But the question here that's asked is the discussion to post read aloud to elicit responses from our audience seems to be an important part of the reading aloud. Is that correct? Right? Would you like to chime in?
I think at the very least offering the opportunity to discuss, that not just to close the book and say, let's go on to this, but like I said, those 3 questions I always ask, just to even open it up. And sometimes kids maybe there should, when maybe we're not far enough into the book yet, do they really have anything to share, or maybe, you know, they're just tired, or maybe, so there's a lot of times that, you know, maybe, you know, just like when any of us, like, I just don't want to talk about that right now. And so that's okay. That's a choice as well. But I just think giving the opportunity, having the time and the space to talk about the book is important. But again, it doesn't have to be an activity, but just having the chance to just chat about it. Because sometimes it might be something in the story where a child doesn't understand, and they say, well, you know, like, oh, they go back, and so you like, oh, we missed that. Let's go back and see where that is, because that might be a really important part of the story. Or they missed a word later, you know, they start thinking about, bubbles up for them. They go, oh, I didn't, you know, can you tell me what that word meant, or why are they doing that? So I think just offering that time and space and opportunity, I think
so
that's what
I've
I'm
actually
really saying.
Absolutely, I've actually said this quite often, that it is the interaction, right? But the interaction may not be directed by you, right? So the interaction might be directed by the child, right? What that child wants to do, right? Or to talk about. And yeah, that child may ask you the meaning of a word, but the follow-up question could be, why does this word cause you to think about something, right? You know, why is this word important? Oh, I just didn't understand this word, but I'm thinking maybe my friend is also like this, right? So it kind of opens up conversation about other things, right?
Some of the best conversations I've ever had with a small group with children, any age, is when somebody may ask a question, and there'll be another child that answers, and then there's this small group discussion that occurs, and it's just, you know, it's just organic, and it's just like that's, to me, again, the power of reading aloud, that I'm not always in control. And that's the other thing too, we need to step back and you know, offer again that time and space, but sometimes just throwing out a question. What are you wondering? And just let them start responding, and also make them understand, make them feel secure and safe, that they can actually have a conversation between themselves as well, not that I don't have to be part of it.
Yeah, that's a good one. Do we have a second poll question? I think we do, about when was the last time you were read aloud to, because there are other questions also that relate to this, and perhaps we can talk about it a little bit. So let's see the results.
Oh my goodness. We should have the Jo Ann and Cyndi story hour, because obviously it's been too long for some people.
Yeah, I know,
they've heard a story read aloud. Oh my goodness.
So when was the last time for you, Cyndi,
that I was read aloud to?
Yeah.
I would have to say about 2 weeks ago. I was at the American Library Association conference, and a friend of mine picked up a book he wanted to share with me, and he said, "Oh, you have to hear this. You have to, you know, here, let me share these first few you know, pages with you." And it was like, oh, yes, and I just loved it. So so it hasn't been that long for me. How about you?
Well, I kind of bond with my friends over this. So for me, it's been recent too, because we read certain books, and we're thinking about how we're developing as people, and, you know, and what should we be thinking about, right? And doing with our lives, etc. So it's been recent as well, right? Reading aloud. There's a question here though that asks, we are limited time. Would you suggest we keep to a short read aloud session, or provide short period of time for kids to read silently, what they enjoy on their own? So it's between really reading aloud and reading silently. Do you wanna take that one?
Sure. I think limited time. I think it always. I have non-negotiables. They're just non-negotiables, and reading aloud is a non-negotiable for me. And so there is a time. It depends on what's important, what you value. I think independent reading is very important, but I also think reading aloud. You can read a poem. You can, like I said, you can read a picture book that takes a very limited amount of time. You can read a very, short story or a chapter. So I just think that there's a lot of different, and you don't have to do it every day. I mean, you can, just say, oh, I found this wonderful poem. I really want to share it with you. I just want to hear just kind of how it resonates in your ear. So I that's where we kind of push aside the read aloud, thinking that kids need to read independently. They do need to read independently, but even more importantly, they do need to hear a book or a story or a poem read aloud.
So it's a question also the student teachers ask, right? Like, how often do I do this, right? And I think I would say in home settings, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say in home settings, try not to routinize it too much. That it's directed by the child, right? But don't let don't let there be, don't let it go for too long. You know what I mean? Like if you haven't done it in 2 weeks, you might want to have a little time, right? Just for books and reading aloud, right? But in
I think young
schools,
children. I was just thinking, young children they value that bedtime read aloud, and that's okay at home. You're probably not going to get your 16-year-old to listen to a bedtime story, but sometimes it's like, just at breakfast before they take off, or in the car, listening to an audiobook or something like that. There's always, again, some time to share that poem or that story or whatever. So I know, so we have to can't regiment it, but sometimes that evening story time is so important, and that relaxing bonding one-on-one time is so important as well.
Yeah, so true, because teenagers really are in a they really have to direct it. But if you see the read aloud and the time to connect over books, right, as a time to connect with the child, right? I think there might be more misses than hits, I think, with this one, because teenagers are just tough, right, to handle. But there's also this opportunity. I also found that teenagers are very responsive if you are going through something as a parent, right? If you are going through something as an adult, and they kind of sense that, that you're kind of going through something, but you're not talking, right? So if you take the spotlight of them, and then they start to notice, right, other things, right? They're quite helpful to give their point of view about things, etc. Right? So the read aloud sometimes takes the spotlight of them and talks about something that they might be interested in the world, etc. Right? But for kids, right, they really want this bonding moment with you, right? And so they will come and ask you, right, for the opportunity to can we read that book, right? Can we do it together? Can we do it now, right? Like, you're in the middle of something. Okay, so I'm just gonna get this done, and then and then we'll do this read aloud, right? So that's the thing. But in school settings, I just became such a popular person, right, with the students, because it was so regular, right? At the start of a lesson, right? And then I'll do this read aloud because they like the book, right? So they actually look forward to the lesson. So I think it can be kind of routinized for school settings, but for home, I think it has to be sort of not routinized so much, right? But don't let it go without doing it for too long. I don't know. What do you think?
I think if, again, through our actions, we we really demonstrate what's important to us. And like I said, what are the non-negotiables, and what are, if it's like with reading aloud, if it's always relegated to the end of the day and we just don't have time, or I'm just too tired, then we say it's not that important. And so I think we have to prioritize, and we have to determine what's the role of reading aloud in this child's life, and also how important is that at home, in the classroom. So it's and again, we just, I know there's like administrators, there's principals that will go into a classroom and say, why are you wasting your time reading aloud?
Reading aloud, exactly.
And I'm just like, I go ballistic over that, because I'm like, oh my goodness, let me talk to your administrator, because as I said, you are teaching everything about reading and writing and about the world, about all this background knowledge, history and people and places and cultures through reading aloud, that those students may never have the opportunity to learn that information. And so why wouldn't we want to just read as widely and as broadly as we possibly can, and extensively? And that's what the reading aloud does. It gives us that opportunity to do all of that, and sometimes in a very short, limited amount of time. But wow, there's a lot we can pack into 10, 15 minutes of a day.
Right? Yeah,
that makes a difference.
And it may not even take that 15 minutes. It might be even less than that, but they're just rapt, right? The students are rapt because they love the book, right? They're just interested in the book. So we've reached the third part, right, which is to talk about some podcasts and how do we incorporate reading aloud into our routines, etc. Right? And I think we kind of touched that with kids, and I think just to tread lightly, right, with just to tread lightly, right, when it comes to home settings, right, not to regulate it too much, and for it to be directed, right, by the children, right. And what about seniors? Do you think have you had any experience with that, Cyndi?
Quite a bit, going into nursing homes, going into assisted living, reading, because of sometimes their eyesight is failing, and again, although it's reading aloud really is that circle of life, and many of the same reasons we read to a child in utero or a newborn are kind of comes into when we read to the elderly, is that it brings a sense of calmness, a sense of story, a sense of bonding. So all of those wonderful things, and especially if somebody who's loves stories but can't read them themselves anymore, and maybe just doesn't have the patience or doesn't want to listen to an audiobook, because they also crave that human interaction. And that's that piece too. Sure, we can listen to an audiobook, but to me, the most powerful books are those that I can share with others. So I have had experience, and it's devastating when I lose someone that I knew, and but I also feel like, well, maybe I gave just a little bit of enjoyment in their life and in their final days. So kind of tear up. I'm sorry thinking, but anyway.
No, right?
Yeah.
This, and we were sharing this in an earlier session, right? But I can remember so clearly when our previous Prime Minister, I was sharing with you, right? When his wife got really, really sick, and there's this lovely picture of him actually reading aloud her favorite book to her as he met with her every evening, right? And the power of that, right? Picture of him doing that, right? That moment of connection, right? And I guess the question that we're asking is, what if you're dealing with whether it's a child or a senior, right? And they're not readers. They really don't have much history with books. Where do you start?
I think there's a book for everybody. I mean, I think we just haven't found the book, right? And so Maybe if it's a reluctant reader, maybe they're very visual. One of the things I want to mention too, picture books are so amazing because they're like this, an illustrator shared with me, it's kind of like holding a little mini museum in your hands. And some of the most gorgeous art is being produced in picture books today. So those children who are a little bit more artistically inclined might be, gravitate toward a beautifully illustrated picture book. A child who maybe is more drawn towards more a comic style, a graphic novel, a lot of that format that is available for young children through obviously through adolescence. Graphic novels are really they're so popular for adolescents, but they're becoming very popular for young children too, because they like that format, and also graphic novels in that graphic comic format. There's not as much text on the page, so it's not quite as intimidating. Novels in verse is another one, where novels in verse are great because again, kids see a lot of white space. They don't see endless text on the page. So it's really about finding that book for that child. It's not. I don't believe that we don't have non-readers. We just have readers that haven't found those books that connect with them.
Yeah, and I guess if you're dealing with people who haven't had the experience of reading and you're starting out, right? I guess choosing a book about their talking points, what they're interested in when they talk and converse with you, that might be a way, right, of getting some entry, right, into them appreciating. So whatever their talking points, if they're talking about world events or they're talking about themselves as, and their own stage-related issues, right? Looking for a book, that sort of deals with these areas, right, is a way in, I think, right? It would be a way in for them to say, okay, who is this that we're reading here? This person is talking about my life, right? So that might be one way, especially for seniors. I think if you're going in and you're reading aloud to them, just listening to them and their talking points, right? What might be their talking about? They might be talking about a certain era. They might be talking about something, right? And just great literature, I think sometimes, right? It's just wonderful for them to hear, right? These things. There's a question here, particularly for you, right? And the person asks if there's some good narrative nonfiction titles for understanding America and the American society. So that's a big question. Right? Whether that might, if you have any titles just off the top of your head, it might be a bit hard though, Cyndi, it's a bit broad. But anything?
About what kind of, where are we looking at? I mean, for
it's nonfiction titles for understanding America and American society.
Okay. Understanding American society. Wow, I don't even understand American society. I think that for older students, I think particularly for adolescents, Candace Fleming, Steve Sheinkin have some amazing narrative nonfiction, long form nonfiction that is just fascinating. Tanya Bolden, an older Russell Friedman, who passed away several years ago, but his books are just amazing narrative nonfiction for a little bit older reading.
Yeah.
And then for a little bit younger, I mean, there are so what's being published today is just amazing. Carol Boston Weatherford is for picture books, particularly. She also has some longer form. She does a lot also with some nonfiction in verse. Candace Fleming again, Deborah Hopkinson, I mean, I can send a list later, and of course, Joanne, who are you? What's bubbling up for you? What names are
I
bubbling
know.
up for you?
Well, I would say go for the American presidents and speeches first,
Sure.
right? Because
Yeah.
that really talks about the aspirational, the values and the aspirational qualities about the American society, and right, and then and then move into these very scientists or artists, or
Yeah.
move into in these areas, right? Rather than and I think any kind of commentaries about that generalizes, I think it doesn't quite work for me, but something that sort of helps to explain, the attitudes, right? How people overcame challenges, great challenges, right? So you walk away thinking, right, that that not so much that you can do it, but more so that sometimes it's worth the risk, right? To go out there and get what you want. So when the Obama book came out, for me, that was a big thing, right? And Michelle Obama and all that was a big thing, because I just wanted to read, right, all their memoirs about these things, right? So it doesn't quite say for children or for adults, but it just talks about America and American society. And
I think biographies. I think biographies is a great way to go. There's so many biographies. I think it really does give you a sense of American society just through reading historical and contemporary figures. So that's really probably. I think you've really touched on that. I think biographies would definitely give you
and it's
sense.
just a lovely genre, isn't it? I just love the genre. This is a bit of experience, and then how they sort of come to understandings, right? Wonderful. So biographies work for me. And related to that is also some ideas about podcasts, right? Are there podcasts maybe, or are podcasts just for adults?
That is not really an area that I'm probably as familiar with as some of the others. I mean, I've been on a few podcasts, but as far as like actually reading aloud, I mean, I'm nothing. I was trying to think about podcasts, and I don't know that with the reading
podcasts,
aloud
I think,
itself.
Yeah, it might be for adults more. I think it really benefits. Like I would listen to a podcast a day, right? And the morning drive-in, and I would listen, right? So more for adults, right? But audiobooks, I suppose, would be the form, right, for children.
I think more so,
right?
Yes.
Yeah, for children, right? A related question, also, of course, would be whether or not you can do this alone or you can do it with a friend, right? Either, right, would be the case, right?
As far as reading aloud, or
as far as podcasts?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I suppose this understanding that reading is very much a community experience, isn't it? Right? This understanding, moving us out of this understanding as a purely cognitive individual experience into this idea that reading is a community experience, right? And we all bring to it so many things, right? To the text, and all of us have a valid point of view, right? If based on how we're responding to the text, right?
Well, we respond through our own lens, our own gender, and our own ethnicity and cultural and geographic region where we live. But then it's expanded when we hear others' perspectives and their connections to a book that we didn't have that same experience or we certainly didn't get that from this story. And we think, wow. But that's where that read aloud starts with here. And then as we begin to talk about it and share it with others, that's where it becomes that community, and that's that community of individuals that that we create. About think about the literary history that we have. That's why sometimes we when we talk about a book, you mentioned Hemingway, so there's this literary history too that we have that bonds us as well as part of that community. So yep. So I know we have some questions, so I want to make sure we can get to some of those too.
I know, right?
I know too many great questions. I know we could just go on forward.
One question about awkwardness about reading aloud. There's one question about awkwardness about reading aloud. I'm gonna try and lead this one, Cyndi, before I hand it over to you. I would say that if you're reading aloud to a child, there's no real need to be awkward, because children are really non-judgmental, and if they are, right, they might want to take over, which is good, right? That they do want to take over. It might be also, right, that when you're you could practice, I guess, reading to yourself, reading aloud to yourself, and then expand it to safer audiences. It could help. Cyndi, would you agree?
I think, I'm not sure where the awkwardness comes from, but that's why I say try to pre-read a book so you feel comfortable with it. Maybe knowing where to kind of pause, where to make that dramatic action, those characters' voices. Again, when you share reading aloud, you want to make it in the most amazing experience possible. Let go of your inhibitions. Have your dramatic self just come out and enjoy it and make it come alive. Because we've all probably heard somebody read aloud a speech or something. You're just like, oh, please, when will this be over? And so we want to present, because we're actually, we're advocating, we're marketing, right? These books in a sense when we read them aloud. So take some time, read it before you read aloud to a child, feel comfortable with the text. And again, maybe if the awkwardness comes from a book that just isn't your book, find a book that maybe you feel more comfortable in sharing, and it'll go. I mean, I'm actually fairly shy. I mean, especially years, I was so shy, but I would read aloud, and there's just something that came out in me, and it was just like, because I wanted to honor that book. I wanted to do the best for that book because it was so powerful, so wonderful. So it wasn't about me. It was about bringing that book to life to share with this child. So if you could keep that perspective as well, how can I honor this book and bringing and reading it aloud?
Yeah, and I guess books with a personal voice, right? There's some personal voice in it. I think that you as a reader who's going to do the reading aloud can connect with. That might help, right? You sort of move into this area of reading aloud, but it's not so much a performance. And I so get this. I have many around me, right, who are, I'm not an introvert, but many around me are introverts. And I think if they connect with the message of the book, right, usually they read aloud, and that nobody's judging you. But kids can be quite, they can actually say, right, mom does a better job than you do with this. And just take it as, they're ready to read on their own, right? The second question is about reading aloud to yourself helps focusing on the text. Does it help with focusing on the text?
I do. I think reading aloud to yourself, because then you can hear it. Your ear can pick up some things. You might hear where you might want to pause, or where you might there might want to even just say. Sometimes we do want to pause and say, "Oh, I wonder what that word is," or "Let me read that sentence again." And so I think reading aloud to yourself helps you to hear that. I mean, I used to read to my dog all the time. He would just like, what, but he look at me. So, I mean, I think just that's also a way to kind of feel a little bit more confident also when you're reading aloud. and really see if that book is a book that you feel comfortable with, and also make sure that you know what the words are in the text.
I know, right?
Sometimes that happens too. You come across a word and go, I have no idea what this is, but that's okay. That's a good learning experience too, because you can say, well, let's look that up real quick. So
there's also this. I think this question has to do with reading aloud as an editing tool. So it's more the oral rehearsal, right? And
like I said, I read aloud when I send in a manuscript. I always read aloud because we all have a word or two that we always use. My husband's word is just. My word is that. I will use the word that over and over, and my ear will pick it up where my eye does not pick it up. So so if you're writing a paper, you're even emails, sometimes I will generally, you'll read aloud an email because does that sound right? When editing reading aloud is a great way. And that's great for kids too. When we do author's chairs, when we have kids come up and they share their writing and so how did that story sound to you when you read it aloud? Is there anything your ear picked up on that you might want to expand on, or you might that didn't quite sound right? So reading aloud.
Absolutely, that's such a good point. Yeah, the oral rehearsal, I think for children also, they will say, no, that's not right. They'll just do the correction there and then sometimes, right? And say, oh no, it's supposed to have a comma here or something like that, right? So
we pick up on that when we see, we need to pause, and the pause means we need to have a comma there, and we don't have a comma there.
Fantastic. The third question would be if we have a favorite book to read aloud.
One of my favorites is The Tale of Despereaux, which was a Newbery Award-winning book by K.D. Camillo. K.D. Camillo is often my go-to person for reading aloud. I have a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons, but if I had to suggest to a parent or a teacher what would be a good book to read aloud, A Tale of Despereaux would probably be one of the ones I would go to. I have a long list, and that's why there's a whole treasury in the Read Aloud Handbook of recommended books to read aloud, but that would be one I definitely recommend.
For me, I think I would expand it a little bit and say that ranging from books as an adult to books for children, actually any book can be read aloud, but it's more difficult if with certain picture books where there's more picture than words, and also more difficult sometimes with graphic books, right? With graphic novels, because so much of the pictures, right, take the messaging. So I would say practically every book can be read aloud, but except for these stories where the messages are coming through more so through the pictures. And with kids' books, right, you can read anything, right, from chapter books, right, etc.
Thank you,
Well,
Audrey.
we've just come, we've got another question, but we've just come to the end. Cindy, thank you so much for this lovely conversation, right, with you about Read Aloud. I feel as if we can go on and on, but it must come to a natural end here as I pass it over to Alex.
Thank you, Cindy and Joanne, for that really rich and insightful conversation. Now I think we've covered so much ground talking about the importance and relevance of reading aloud to our kids, and even as an adult with so many practical tips.